Dr. Marcus Reed had spent years earning the title of doctor, only to have it torn away in a single, brutal moment. A black man in a world that never stopped reminding him of his place. His success was never enough to shield him from the hatred that festered beneath the surface. One night, his car is vandalized by a group of racist teens, and when they think they've got away with it, a shocking twist forces them to face the consequences of their actions in a way they never saw coming. The rain was relentless, cascading from the sky in thin sheets that blurred the edges of the city. The dull hum of traffic, the sound of tires slicing through the water, was a constant companion, as if the whole world was drowning in the gray melancholy that clung to the streets. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that pressed against everything, every person, every soul trying to make it through another day. The city, once vibrant with the promises of opportunity, felt cold and indifferent now, wrapped in a shroud of urban decay. Dr. Camille Johnson stood beneath the awning of her office building, her back pressed against the cold concrete, watching the rain cascade down in streams. The black sedan, parked a few feet away, gleamed under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Her gaze lingered on it for a moment, the weariness in her eyes betraying her exhaustion. But she didn't move. Not yet. The world around her seemed to shift, as if she could feel the tension in the air before it fully manifested. It was a feeling she'd grown used to, but still couldn't shake. The sense that everything in her life had become a fight to be seen, a fight to be heard, a fight to be respected, a fight she never asked for. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the edges of her jacket tighter around her frame, but she quickly masked it with a deep, steady breath. Camille wasn't one to show weakness, at least not on the outside, but inside. The fatigue from years of battling both the implicit and explicit biases of her profession gnawed at her like an unseen predator. She was a black woman, a doctor in a predominantly white field, and though she had worked tirelessly to carve out a place for herself, the road was never easy. Every success felt like it had to be earned 10 times over. She had fought for the title of doctor more than once, from colleagues who saw her as nothing more than an anomaly, to patients who doubted her abilities because of the color of her skin. As she adjusted her glasses, a moment of clarity struck her. Today wasn't just another routine, another battle fought in silence. Today felt different. There was an unease settling in her gut, an intuition that something was about to shift. The sound of footsteps on wet pavement broke her from her thoughts. She glanced up, noticing a group of teens walking down the street. Their voices were loud and full of laughter, a carefree energy that seemed out of place in the bleakness of the evening. Camille's eyes flickered to them, then back to the sedan. She didn't recognize them. She rarely did. They passed her without a second glance, but Camille felt their presence, felt the sting of judgment that lingered in the air as if they could see her. The black woman standing alone in the rain, a doctor, someone they'd likely never even consider as their equal. It wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel invisible, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. She sighed softly, her breath clouding in the chill. Just make it through tonight, she thought to herself as she turned to head inside. But just as she took a step, a sharp noise cut through the quiet of the evening, a loud, jarring sound, followed by the unmistakable crash of something heavy hitting metal. Camille's heart skipped a beat, and her body tensed instinctively. She turned just in time to see one of the teens hurling a rock at the rearview mirror of her car, the glass splintering in the air. A flare of anger rose in her chest. She could feel her pulse quicken, her hands balling into fists, but she swallowed it down. This wasn't new. This wasn't unexpected. She had faced worse in her life. Before she could react, the group of teens scattered, retreating down the street with barely a glance back at the damage they'd caused. The silence that followed was suffocating. Camille's car, her only means of transportation, now bore the marks of their violence. The rearview mirror hung by a thread, the metal dented from the force of the rock. It was a stark, brutal reminder of the world she lived in, one that could turn its back on her so easily. For a moment, Camille stood frozen, staring at the damage, her mind racing. Was it just an act of random teenage mischief? Or was it something more? Something deliberate? Something personal? A knot tightened in her stomach. She had no answers, only more questions. And then the instinct kicked in. Her hand reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She needed evidence. She couldn't let this go unnoticed. She needed to protect herself, to hold those who believed they could target her accountable. She tapped quickly at her phone, the familiar feeling of urgency pushing her forward. The security cameras in the parking lot would have caught everything. It was a small comfort, but it was something. She wasn't about to let this go unanswered. As she approached the building entrance, her phone buzzing with the notification of a new security clip, Camille allowed herself a brief moment to take a breath. There were no tears, no anger-filled outbursts. Just the cold, calculated resolve of someone who had seen too much of this to be shocked. The system was broken, but she would fix it. She had to. When the doors slid open, the warmth of the lobby hit her like a wave, but the sense of unease stayed with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, the rock, the broken mirror, the teens' retreating figures, was just the beginning. Her phone buzzed again. The video clip had uploaded. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening once more. As the footage loaded, she braced herself for what she was about to see. She had no idea what was coming next. The phone screen flickered, and Camille's breath hitched in her chest as she stared at the video. It was grainy, the night's shadows pooling in the corners of the footage, but there was no mistaking the faces of the teenagers who had vandalized her car. As the camera zoomed in on them, their laughter could almost be heard through the digital haze, their movements jerky and quick as they hurled the rock, then ran away, disappearing into the darkness. Camille felt a cold chill settle deep in her bones as she watched the footage replay. The teens didn't look scared or remorseful. They weren't acting out of drunken recklessness. They were doing this with purpose, like they knew exactly what they were doing. Something about their demeanor twisted her stomach, and she couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was something more to this than a random act of vandalism. Her finger hovered over the screen, rewinding the video again. The teen who threw the rock stood out. There was a familiarity to his face, a look that haunted her. He wasn't just some random kid. No, there was something more. She'd seen him before. The thought barely had time to settle in her mind before the shrill ringing of her office phone shattered the moment. Camille let out a small gasp, almost as though the sudden interruption had broken the fragile thread of clarity she had been holding on to. She wiped her palms against her pants before picking up the receiver, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Johnson." "Camille." The voice on the other end was sharp and professional, but there was an edge to it. Her heart sank when she recognized it. Dr. Mark Simmons, her supervisor at the clinic. "I need you to come in. Now." Her pulse quickened, and the unease she'd been feeling deepened. She had been expecting a routine check-in, maybe a bit of small talk, but the tone of his voice, it wasn't the usual. There was something urgent. "Is everything all right, Mark?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising anxiety in her chest. "It's about one of your patients. We've had an incident. Just come to my office." The line clicked, and Camille was left with a growing knot of dread in her stomach. Her eyes flitted back to the phone screen. The teens' faces were still etched in her mind. She had to figure out who they were. She would deal with it later. Right now, something felt off, and she needed to go to the clinic. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed as Camille walked down the long corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The building felt different at night. The usual energy of bustling staff and patients was replaced with an unsettling quiet, as though something was waiting in the shadows. Dr. Simmons's office door was slightly ajar, and Camille paused before entering, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She pushed it open without knocking. Inside, Dr. Simmons was pacing by the window, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He didn't look up when she entered, his eyes fixed on the city skyline that lay far beyond the glass. "You wanted to see me?" Camille asked, her voice calm but firm. Dr. Simmons turned, his expression tense. "Yes. I'm afraid we have a situation on our hands, Camille." His voice softened, almost as if he were reluctant to say the words out loud. "It's about one of our patients. A girl. A young woman, actually." Camille's mind raced. Another patient in distress. She'd handled those before, but there was a heaviness in his words that she couldn't ignore. "What happened?" Simmons ran a hand through his hair, his gaze dropping to the floor. "She's been receiving threatening messages. I'm afraid it's more serious than that. We suspect someone's been following her. Her father's concerned. He's even hired private security." Camille frowned, her mind processing the details. "Who is she? And why wasn't I informed earlier?" "Her name's Eliza Rivers. She's a patient in our dermatology department. Her father, Peter Rivers, is a well-known figure in the city. He's a major donor to the hospital. You haven't had direct contact with her, but we've had some involvement with her case. The threats have escalated, and now it's become more than just a case of harassment." Camille's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? How has it escalated?" Dr. Simmons didn't immediately respond, but his eyes darkened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "Our father thinks she's been targeted because of him, because of his political stance. It's possible someone is trying to send a message. It's not just a random threat. It's personal." Camille felt a chill run through her, the weight of the situation settling over her like a dark cloud. "Is she safe? Have the authorities been involved?" "We've had some conversations with the police, but her father refuses to get them more involved. He wants to handle it privately. We have to respect that." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Camille's mind kept racing, trying to piece things together. There was something about the whole situation that didn't sit right with her, as if all the pieces weren't in place. "The reason I'm telling you this, Camille," Dr. Simmons continued, his tone shifting, "is because we need your help. You're one of the only people who has experience dealing with high-profile cases like this. We need you to speak with Eliza, to get a sense of the situation. Her father trusts you." Camille swallowed, the implications of his words settling like lead in her stomach. "You want me to get involved? Deeper than just a consultation? I know it's a lot to ask, but we're in a tight spot. Her father's making demands, and the situation is growing more volatile by the hour. We need someone who can handle delicate situations, someone with a steady hand." Camille nodded slowly, but her mind was already elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just about Eliza. It was about something bigger, something darker. "I'll speak with her," Camille said, her voice resolute, even as 1,000 questions swirled in her mind. "But I need full access to all the details. Everything." Dr. Simmons hesitated, but then nodded. "Of course. I'll have the files sent to your office." As Camille turned to leave, her phone buzzed again, a notification from the security footage. The clip had been updated. Her eyes flickered to the screen, a small but significant detail catching her attention. One of the teens from the video was standing under a street lamp, his face partially obscured by shadows. But as the image sharpened, the familiar, haunting expression from earlier appeared. It was him, the boy who had thrown the rock. Her heart stopped. This wasn't a random act. Camille was certain of it now. This was personal, and someone was pulling strings that tied her to this girl, to her father, and to the darkness that had been quietly closing in on her life. She couldn't ignore it. She had to dig deeper. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Camille left the clinic in a haze, her mind fixed on the new reality unfolding around her. She wasn't just a bystander in this. She had a role to play, whether she liked it or not. There were questions to be answered, mysteries to uncover, and she was already in the thick of it. But as the city lights flickered in the distance and the night pressed in around her, Camille couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. She was being watched. She could feel it. And somewhere, in the depths of all of this, a betrayal waited, one she hadn't yet seen coming. Camille sat across from Eliza in a small, sterile room in the clinic. The walls were a muted shade of beige, the light from the overhead fixtures cold and uninviting. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, and it felt as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Eliza sat stiffly in the chair opposite Camille, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was a striking young woman with dark, expressive eyes that had once shimmered with promise but were now dulled with fear. Her blonde hair, though impeccably styled, hung loosely around her shoulders, as though she hadn't bothered to fix it after the day's events. Camille had read through Eliza's file earlier, noting the history of threats and intimidation, messages, phone calls, even strangers who followed her in the street. It wasn't just a random string of events. It was a calculated campaign to instill fear. Yet, there was something about Eliza's demeanor now that unsettled Camille. It wasn't just the fear. There was an undercurrent of something darker, something Eliza was withholding. The silence stretched between them until Camille finally spoke, her voice calm but probing. "Eliza," she began gently, "your father told me you've been receiving threats. I need you to be honest with me about everything. We can't help you unless you tell me the full story." Eliza's eyes flickered toward the door, almost as if she were weighing her options. Her lips trembled for a moment, but she held herself together, pushing her emotions down. She finally looked Camille in the eye, and for a split second, Camille saw a flash of something in those eyes, anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't place. "I told you everything," Eliza said, her voice tight. She didn't raise it, but the edge was there. "What more do you want to know? You think I'm hiding something?" Camille leaned forward, her tone softening as she spoke. "I don't think you're hiding anything, but I do think you might be afraid to speak the truth. And that's okay. We all have our reasons." The words hung in the air, and Eliza's gaze dropped to the floor. For a moment, Camille thought the conversation was over. But then, Eliza spoke again, this time more quietly. "You don't know what it's like to be watched, to feel like every move you make is being scrutinized, like someone is always right behind you, just waiting for the right moment." Eliza's voice trembled slightly, but she quickly regained control. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be a target. I'm just trying to live my life." Camille's heart softened, but there was something about Eliza's words that didn't sit right with her. It was the way she avoided the specifics of the threats, the way her gaze constantly flickered away from Camille's, as if she were hiding something, or worse, lying. "I understand," Camille said gently, "but you need to trust me. Eliza, the truth will help us protect you. We can't help if you don't tell us everything." Eliza stared at her hands for a long moment before lifting her head, a look of resolve on her face. "I'm not hiding anything. I just don't want to drag my father into this more than I have to. He's already been through enough." Camille's mind spun. There was more to this. She could feel it, like a presence in the room. Eliza's hesitation, the tightness in her voice, it wasn't just fear. It was something else. Before Camille could respond, the door to the office opened abruptly. Dr. Simmons entered, his expression serious. Camille noticed a flicker of something guilt in his eyes, but it was gone so quickly she wasn't sure if she'd imagined it. "Eliza, I'll leave you two to talk," Dr. Simmons said curtly, offering a nod to Camille before leaving the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and Camille was left alone with Eliza once more. As soon as the door closed, the tension in the room thickened, and Eliza's composure faltered. She stared at the door for a moment, then whispered, "He doesn't believe me either. No one does." "Who?" Camille asked, her voice soft but insistent. "Dr. Simmons," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He thinks I'm making it up, that I'm exaggerating, that I'm just trying to get attention." Eliza's hands clenched into fists. "But I'm not." Camille watched her closely, weighing her words. There was a vulnerability in Eliza now, a rawness that hadn't been there before. It made Camille feel like she was seeing the girl for the first time, really seeing her. "Why do you think he feels that way?" Camille asked gently, her voice soothing. "I don't know," Eliza said with a shaky laugh. "I guess he just doesn't get it. He's too caught up in his own world. He doesn't understand what it's like to be scared, to be afraid for your life. He's too busy making money and playing golf and doing whatever rich people do. He doesn't care about what's happening to me." Her words hit Camille harder than she expected. There was so much anger behind them, so much pain, and it was all directed at her father, the man who, from all appearances, seemed to dote on his daughter. Camille couldn't help but wonder what had happened between them to create this rift. "I'm sorry," Camille said quietly. "I know it's hard, but you have to trust me, Eliza. We need to work together if we're going to find out who's behind these threats." For a moment, Eliza's eyes softened, and Camille saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. But just as quickly, that hope was smothered, and Eliza's expression hardened again. "Trust you," Eliza repeated bitterly. "How can I trust anyone, Camille? Everyone around me is either lying or pretending everything's fine. My father, the people at the clinic, even you." She shook her head, standing up quickly. "You don't know what it's like to be me. You don't know what it's like to have everything taken from you." Camille rose from her seat, stepping closer to her. "I may not know exactly what you're going through, Eliza, but I do know what it's like to feel powerless, to feel like you're fighting a battle no one sees. And I can help you fight it, but you have to let me in. You have to trust me." Eliza's eyes softened for a moment, and Camille saw the faintest glimmer of vulnerability behind her sharp exterior. But then, without warning, Eliza turned on her heel and walked toward the door. "I'm done talking," Eliza said coldly, her voice distant. "I'll talk to you when I'm ready." Camille stood frozen for a moment, watching her leave. The door clicked shut behind Eliza, and the silence in the room was deafening. Camille stood there, her thoughts swirling. "There's something more to this," she thought, her mind racing. "Something she's not saying, and I have to find out what it is." But as the weight of Eliza's words pressed down on her, Camille realized there was something even more unsettling. If Eliza's hiding something, what does that say about the people around her? And more importantly, what does it say about Dr. Simmons? The night was heavy with tension, the kind that clung to the skin like damp fog. Camille stood at the foot of the staircase, her hand resting on the cold banister. She had been summoned back to Dr. Simmons' mansion after a day full of questions, unanswered ones that gnawed at her like hunger pains. She could feel the weight of the silence hanging in the air, heavy enough to snap, but just fragile enough to remain undisturbed. Eliza had disappeared, vanishing as quickly as she had entered, leaving Camille to wonder if her suspicions were justified. There was something off, something Eliza had been hiding, something that was slowly unraveling at the seams. Her steps were deliberate as she ascended the staircase, the soft click of her heels punctuating the quiet. The house was enormous, and despite the grandeur, it felt suffocating. Each room seemed to hold a secret. Each hallway whispered of things left unsaid. The mansion was a stark contrast to the clean, clinical air of the office she had been in earlier, a place where nothing was ever quite as it seemed. As she reached the top of the stairs, Camille heard voices coming from the study. It was Dr. Simmons and Eliza. Their voices, muffled but unmistakably heated, cut through the stillness. Camille hesitated, uncertainty flooding her mind. She could leave and wait for them to cool down, but there was something inside her that urged her to stay, to listen. She quietly moved closer to the study door, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. What she overheard next would change everything. Dr. Simmons' voice was sharp, his usual calm demeanor now crackling with frustration. "I told you, Eliza, this isn't the way to handle things. You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm not playing father," Eliza snapped. "I'm trying to survive." The bitterness in her tone was unmistakable, raw. "You never understood that, did you?" There was a long pause, the tension thick in the air. Camille's breath caught in her chest as she pressed herself further against the wall, unable to pull away. Dr. Simmons' voice softened, but the sharp edge remained. "I've always done what I thought was best for you. But this, what you're involved in now, it's not just dangerous for you, it's dangerous for everyone around you." A deep sigh escaped Eliza. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't realize what's at stake? But I'm not like you. I don't have the luxury of playing it safe. I don't know what you mean by that, Dr. Simmons said, his voice now cold. I've given you everything you ever wanted, Eliza. This isn't just some act of rebellion. You're making enemies, and I can't protect you from that. A shiver ran down Camille's spine. Enemies? What was Eliza involved in? There was another long silence, and then Eliza spoke again, her voice low and dangerous. You don't need to protect me anymore, Father. I've already made my choice. Camille could hear the faint sound of footsteps, and before she could react, the door to the study swung open, and Eliza emerged, her eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and something darker, something Camille couldn't quite place. As Eliza passed by her, Camille took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Eliza didn't even glance in her direction, her mind seemingly elsewhere as she disappeared down the hall. Camille's thoughts were racing. What had just happened? What had she heard? Unable to resist, Camille slowly pushed open the door to the study, her pulse quickening. Dr. Simmons was standing by the window, his back turned to her. He didn't hear her enter. Dr. Simmons, Camille said, her voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. He turned sharply, his face a mask of composure. But there was a flicker in his eyes, something fleeting that made Camille pause. For a moment, she wondered if she had made a mistake, if she had misheard something. But the doubt quickly vanished when she saw the expression in his eyes. Camille, he said, his tone cool and controlled. I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right? Dr. Simmons, Camille repeated, stepping further into the room, her gaze fixed on him. I heard what you and Eliza were talking about. For a brief second, she thought he would deny it. But then his eyes narrowed, and his lips tightened in an expression that was both guarded and resigned. What did you hear? He asked, his voice tight with a tension Camille couldn't ignore. I heard enough, Camille replied, crossing her arms over her chest. Enough to know that there's something you're not telling me. You said Eliza was making enemies. What did you mean by that? Dr. Simmons stared at her, his face hardening. He was silent for a long moment, and Camille could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. It was as if he were weighing his options, trying to decide whether to lie or tell the truth. I didn't want you involved in this, Camille, he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. But I can see that you're already too far in. Camille's heart skipped a beat. What does that mean? Dr. Simmons sighed deeply and walked over to his desk, reaching into the drawer and pulling out a folder. He placed it on the table in front of her, his fingers lingering over it for a moment. This is why Eliza's been so tense. Why she's been hiding. She's been working with people she shouldn't be. People I try to protect her from. Camille's eyes narrowed. Who? Dr. Simmons met her gaze, and for the first time, Camille saw something close to regret in his eyes. It's complicated. Eliza, she got involved with a group that deals with things, dangerous things I can't afford to have her mixed up in. And when she went off on her own, I tried to keep her safe, but I failed. Camille's breath caught. This was far worse than she had imagined. So you knew. I knew, he confirmed, but I didn't know how deep it went. I never thought she'd be involved with. With what? Camille was about to ask when a sharp noise interrupted their conversation, like the sound of a door slamming. Both of them turned toward the source, but before Camille could react, Dr. Simmons moved toward the door. You need to leave. Now, he said, his voice clipped. Before it's too late. Camille was caught off guard. What's going on? I'll explain later, but right now you need to get out of here. There's no time. His face had gone pale, his earlier composure shattered. Before Camille could protest, Dr. Simmons grabbed her arm and led her toward the door. Please, Camille, trust me. Just go. As Camille stepped out into the hallway, the weight of Dr. Simmons' words sank in. Eliza had been involved with a dangerous group, one that Dr. Simmons had tried and failed to keep her away from. But there was something more. The urgency in Dr. Simmons' voice, the pale look on his face. He was hiding something he wasn't telling her. As Camille reached the door, ready to leave, She stopped, her eyes catching a glimpse of something on the floor, a torn piece of paper. She bent down to pick it up and read the cryptic message scrawled in bold, frantic handwriting. If you want to find her, don't trust your father. Camille stood on the edge of the dark street, her mind racing. The message she discovered, scrawled hastily on a torn piece of paper, still felt like an unshakable weight in her hand. If you want to find her, don't trust your father. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable a relentless reminder that nothing was as it seemed. She had wanted to believe in Dr. Simmons, his professionalism, his calm demeanor, his quiet assurances. But the weight of his secrets hung heavy in the air. Eliza had been involved with something dangerous, something far darker than Camille had initially imagined. And Dr. Simmons? He had tried to protect her, but now it was clear. He had kept more than just his daughter's secrets. His own role in this labyrinth of lies and deception was still unknown, but Camille couldn't afford to trust him anymore. Not without knowing the whole truth. Camille walked briskly through the empty street, the cold biting at her skin. The city felt different now, more menacing, more alien. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every turn whispered of danger. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled out, heart thumping. It was a message from an unknown number. Meet me at the diner on 5th. Come alone. This isn't over. Camille hesitated, her fingers trembling over the screen. Who was this? Someone who knew about Eliza, about her father's secrets, or someone trying to manipulate her into something more dangerous? She glanced over her shoulder. The street was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of city traffic. Despite the cold, her skin was slick with sweat. This could be a trap. It could be a lie. But she knew, deep down, she had to follow this lead. Eliza was out there, and time was slipping through her fingers like sand. She didn't know who to trust anymore, but one thing was certain. She couldn't stop now. The diner on 5th was a relic from another era, a small, weathered building with flickering neon lights and the faint scent of stale coffee in the air. Camille pushed open the door, the bell above her head ringing softly as she stepped inside. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few late-night patrons hunched over their meals in quiet solitude. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on each person, wondering if one of them was the source of the message. At a corner booth, a figure sat, draped in shadows. The dim light above cast a halo around their head, making it impossible to make out their features. Camille's heart quickened. Could be. Was this the person who held the key to everything? She approached cautiously, her hand lingering near her purse, where she kept a small piece of pepper spray. She wasn't taking any chances tonight. Camille, I presume? The voice was low, a soft rasp that seemed to carry through the still air. Camille froze. She knew that voice. She had heard it before. Eliza. Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with disbelief. The figure leaned forward, and the dim light revealed a woman with sharp, striking features. Eliza, but not quite. Her once confident posture was now hunched, her eyes dark with exhaustion, and her face gaunt as though a heavy weight pressed down on her. Eliza's lips curled into a tired smile. You look surprised. Her voice was dry, tinged with something like regret. I thought you'd figured out by now. Camille slid into the booth across from her, feeling a strange mix of relief and caution. What is this? Why the message? Why did you disappear? I thought. You thought I was gone, Eliza finished for her, her gaze distant. I had to disappear. It's the only way. You don't understand, Camille. There's no safe place anymore. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, I'm being hunted. Camille's heart skipped a beat. Hunted? By who? By the same people your father's been hiding from, Eliza replied, her voice growing softer. People who want everything. Power. Control. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. The revelation hit Camille like a blow to the chest. Dr. Simmons had never spoken about anyone hunting him. No mention of enemies. No threats. Had he really kept her in the dark that much? Was he truly as helpless as he had led her to believe? Or was there more to this story? Why didn't you tell me? Camille's voice cracked with emotion. Why didn't you trust me? Eliza's eyes softened for a moment, and she reached across the table, her fingers brushing Camille's. Because I didn't want to put you in danger. I couldn't, Camille. You're not prepared for what's out there. I didn't want to drag you into this world. Camille jerked her hand back, a surge of frustration rising inside her. So you kept me in the dark? You lied to me for months. You used me. No, Eliza's voice was firm now, her eyes flashing with determination. I never used you, but I had to keep you safe. You don't understand. The people after us, they'll destroy everything. Who are they? What do they want with your father? Eliza's gaze hardened, and she leaned back in her seat. They want control over everything your father's built, over everything he's hiding. Camille stared at her, her breath catching in her throat. Control over everything her father had built. That wasn't just about power, it was about something much bigger. The stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. But why? Why did he keep it from me? Camille's voice was a mixture of betrayal and confusion. She had always looked up to Dr. Simmons. He had been her rock, her source of guidance, someone she believed would never deceive her. Eliza sighed, rubbing her temples. Because he's been a part of this world for a long time, and he's in too deep. He thought he could protect you, but in reality, he's just trying to save himself. The weight of the conversation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Camille sat back, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She didn't know who to believe anymore, Eliza, who had vanished without a trace and now seemed to have her own agenda, or Dr. Simmons, the man who had always been there for her, but who now seemed to have secrets so dark they threatened to swallow them both. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the door, but when she turned back, Eliza was gone. Just like that. No explanation. No warning. No goodbye. Camille stood up quickly, feeling her stomach churn with a mixture of fear and frustration. She had to know more. She had to find out the truth, even if it meant losing everything she thought she knew. Eliza had given her the key, but it was up to Camille to turn it. The phone in her pocket buzzed again, and she pulled it out, reading the new message. It's time to choose, Camille. Your next move will decide everything. Choose wisely. Her breath hitched in her throat. The uncertainty was suffocating. She could follow Eliza's lead, search for the truth at any cost, risk everything to uncover the secrets her father was hiding. Or she could walk away, leave the world of lies and danger behind, and go back to her normal life. But she knew deep down that there was no going back. There never had been. Standing there, in the half-empty diner, Camille felt the full weight of her dilemma. She wasn't sure which path to take, whether to continue down the rabbit hole of betrayal, secrets, and darkness, or to shut it all down, to walk away and try to rebuild her life, piece by piece. But the truth had already started to change her. It had shifted something inside her, igniting a fire she could no longer ignore. The truth was out there, and no matter how much it hurt, she had to face it. She had made her choice. And now, there was no turning back. The air in the abandoned warehouse felt suffocating. It was heavy with dust, the kind that settled in every crevice of the forgotten corners. Camille's heart pounded, each beat echoing in her ears, drowning out the silence that stretched across the room. She hadn't expected this. Not like this. The confrontation she'd been preparing for, dreaded, feared, had arrived. And now, there was no turning back. The dim lights above flickered sporadically, casting long, jittery shadows along the cracked concrete floor. Her eyes darted to every corner, every crevice, but she saw nothing except the remnants of a place long abandoned. This is where it all ends, Camille thought, but her breath came too fast, betraying the uncertainty she still couldn't shake. The message had led her here. The cryptic warning from Eliza, the sudden appearance of her father's associates, the dawning realization that everything had been a game from the start. But now, at the edge of this warehouse, Camille faced the truth in its rawest form. Camille, came the low, gravelly voice. Her body stiffened at the sound, her fists clenching involuntarily. It was Dr. Simmons, her father, standing at the far end of the warehouse in shadow, his figure obscured. The faintest outline of his face was visible, but his eyes were hard, like stone. There was a weight in the air, a pressure that seemed to press in from every angle. "You came," he said, his voice quieter now, almost softer, as if the revelation of this moment was more than just a confrontation. It was an admission. Camille didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, her mind racing. "Why did you do this, Dad? Why didn't you tell me?" Her father's secrets, his hidden life. It was too much to bear. He had promised her safety. He had promised her trust. And now, in the stark silence of this decaying building, all of that seemed like a lie. She took a hesitant step forward, but the air felt like it was pushing against her, unwilling to let her move closer. It was as though the distance between them wasn't just physical. It was emotional, irreparable. Dr. Simmons stepped into the dim light, his face now visible, but there was something off about his expression. It wasn't anger or fear. It was resignation, as if he knew this moment had been inevitable, that there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. "Do you know why you're here, Camille?" His voice was almost lost in the space between them, strained with something she couldn't quite name. "You think you've uncovered everything. The truth, the secrets, the lies. But there's so much more. Things you don't understand, things I've protected you from for as long as I could." Her heart clenched at his words. She was fighting to hold onto the fragments of her old life, to make sense of the jagged pieces now scattered around her. "You've lied to me," Camille finally managed, her voice raw, fragile but resolute. "You've lied about everything. And now, all of this, it's your fault." Her words cut through the space, but Dr. Simmons remained unmoved. His gaze was steady, unflinching. It was almost as if the weight of his own guilt had anchored him in place, preventing him from moving forward or backward. "I didn't want this for you, Camille," he said, his voice suddenly breaking. "But you were always meant to know. You had to. The world you're about to walk into, it doesn't leave room for innocence. It doesn't leave room for anything but survival." Camille felt a cold chill run through her. What does that even mean? Her voice wavered, the words almost too heavy to speak. Her father stepped closer, his face tightening with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "Eliza's gone. The truth about her, you won't find it here. You won't find her." He stopped, eyes softening for just a second. "I try to protect you, Camille, but she's part of this. All of this." A flood of emotion surged in her chest. She had known Eliza, had cared for her, trusted her. But Eliza's disappearance, her messages, everything. It didn't make sense. "What do you mean she's part of this?" Camille asked, her voice trembling now, edged with desperation. "She was your daughter too. You loved her." "I didn't just love her," Dr. Simmons replied, his voice hard now, controlled. "I try to keep her safe from this world. But Eliza wanted more than safety. She wanted power. And now, you're standing in the middle of it all, not knowing who to trust, what to believe. She was never the person you thought she was." The weight of his words hit Camille like a blow. Everything had been a lie. A game where everyone had played their part, from Eliza to her father, and now, she was in the center of it. There was no room left for innocence, no space to protect herself. The walls were closing in, and every piece of information she had gathered seemed to shatter into 1,000 shards, each one cutting deeper. "You're asking me to forgive you," Camille said, her voice hoarse, her tears threatening to break through, but she held them back. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when the truth was staring her in the face. "But I don't know if I can." Dr. Simmons stepped forward again, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his face etched with the kind of sorrow only years of regret could carve. "I know, Camille, and I don't expect you to. I've failed you, and I've failed Eliza, but I had no choice. In this world, there is no room for weakness." Before Camille could respond, a sound echoed from the back of the warehouse, a creaking of floorboards, followed by a voice. The voice Camille had been dreading, yet somehow expecting. "Eliza," Camille whispered, as her body tensed. A figure emerged from the shadows, and there she was, Eliza, but not the way Camille had left her. She was different, paler, colder, her eyes devoid of the warmth Camille had once seen in them. There was a hardness to her now, an edge that had never been there before. "Camille," Eliza said, her tone low, almost accusatory. "You shouldn't have come." "Why, Eliza?" Camille's voice cracked, the tears threatening to overwhelm her. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you trust me?" Eliza's lips twisted into a cold, emotionless smile. "Trust? You still don't get it, do you?" She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Camille's. "None of this was ever about trust. It was about power. The power I'm about to take." Before Camille could respond, Dr. Simmons moved quickly, grabbing her arm. "No, Camille," he said, his voice urgent. "Don't. You don't understand. Eliza, she's—" But Camille ripped her arm from his grasp, the flood of rage and sorrow surging forward. "You both lied to me, all this time. And now, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know who you are." Eliza laughed bitterly, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous glint. "You'll understand soon enough. And when you do, you'll realize there was never a choice for you to make. It was always decided." The warehouse filled with an eerie silence, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. The final confrontation was upon them, the truth laid bare. But as Camille stood there, facing the two people she had once trusted above all others, she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The cold, echoing silence that followed Eliza's chilling words felt like an eternity. Camille stood in the center of the vast, shadow-filled warehouse, her legs trembling, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. The air was heavy, thick with years of hidden secrets, regret, and betrayal. Everything had led to this moment. She could still feel her father's grasp on her arm, the desperation in his eyes when he had tried to stop her from confronting Eliza. But now, even his presence seemed like a distant echo. It no longer mattered. In this moment, Camille knew she had no one left to trust, no one who could save her from the fractured reality they had all created. Eliza stepped forward, her gaze cold and calculating. There was no warmth left in her eyes, no trace of the sisterly bond they once shared. Camille could barely recognize the woman standing before her. This was not the Eliza she had grown up with, the caring, protective older sibling. This woman was someone else entirely, consumed by ambition, power, and a dangerous desire for control. "You think you can stop me, Camille?" Eliza's voice was icy, almost amused, as she circled Camille like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're too late. Everything has already been set into motion." Camille's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stand tall, drawing from the remnants of her strength. "I don't care what you've set in motion, Eliza," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "You won't win. Not like this." Eliza's lips curled into a tight, mirthless smile. "You're naive, Camille. You still believe in some version of good and evil, right and wrong. You think I'm the villain here, but you don't understand. None of us ever had a choice. We were born into this. This world doesn't give you options. It gives you survival." The words stung, but Camille refused to let them break her. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't let Eliza continue this twisted game any longer. The weight of the revelation hung over her like a storm cloud, but within her, there was a flicker of hope, an ember of defiance that she wasn't ready to extinguish just yet. "I'll make my own choice," Camille said, her voice trembling but resolute. "And that choice is not to let you destroy everything." Before Eliza could respond, Dr. Simmons spoke, his voice hoarse from the emotions he had been fighting to suppress. "Camille, please. I never wanted this. I wanted to protect you." His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking as he stepped toward her. "This world, this life I chose. It's not what I wanted for you, but it's the life you were born into." Camille's gaze softened for a fleeting moment. She wanted to believe him, to find some trace of the man she had once called father, the one who had promised to protect her. But the truth was clearer now than it had ever been. He had failed her. He had failed them both. And there was no going back. "Don't need your protection anymore," Camille said, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. "I can't live in a world where lies and manipulation are the only truths. I've made my choice, and it's not you. Not Eliza. Not any of this." With that, Camille turned away from her father, from the darkness of the warehouse, from everything that had once been familiar. Her heart ached, but there was something else rising within her, a sense of liberation, of release. She didn't need to carry the burden of their choices any longer. She was free. "Camille," her father called after her, but his voice was faint, distant. The walls between them had become too thick, too strong. She couldn't hear him anymore, not the way she used to. And then there was Eliza, her figure looming over Camille like a shadow. "You think you've won," she spat, her voice rising with anger. "You think walking away will change anything? You're nothing. You're just like the rest of them. Weak." The words cut deep, but Camille didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to face Eliza one last time. "I'm nothing like you," she said, her voice unwavering. "I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's." The confrontation between them was over, but it wasn't the explosive finale Camille had expected. No grand battle, no dramatic clash, just a quiet, final acknowledgement that everything they had once known had disintegrated. But as Camille walked toward the exit, a sudden, unsettling realization gripped her heart. There was no victory in this, no triumph, no relief. The truth had been laid bare, but it was hollow. What had all this been for? What did it mean? Outside, the sky was dark, the moon hidden behind a blanket of clouds. The world seemed unchanged, indifferent to the battles fought in the shadows of the warehouse. Camille's footsteps echoed on the pavement, but each step felt heavier, burdened with the weight of everything she had learned. She stopped and looked up at the sky. It was vast, endless. There had to be more out there, more to life than this endless cycle of lies and betrayals. And yet, for all the choices she had made, for all the action she had taken, Camille couldn't help but wonder if any of it had truly mattered. As Camille stood in the silence of the night, the truth of her journey sank in, heavy and irreversible. She had made the hard choices, faced the betrayal, the violence, the lies. But at what cost? Her father, the one person who had raised her, who had promised her protection, had been part of a system that destroyed everything they had once stood for. And Eliza, her own sister, had become a cold, calculated figure, blinded by power, consumed by ambition. But where did that leave Camille? She couldn't change the past. She couldn't undo the damage they had caused. Yet she realized in this moment of reflection that perhaps the greatest victory was not in the revenge, the confrontation, or even the choices of those around her. It was in her ability to choose for herself. She didn't need anyone's validation to be whole. She didn't need to follow the path they had set before her. In the end, the power to shape her future lay in her hands. Camille knew the road ahead would be difficult. The scars of betrayal, of a life torn apart, would never fully heal. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, a belief that, despite everything, she could rebuild. She could find peace, even in the aftermath of the storm. The world may be broken, but Camille wasn't. Not yet. And with that realization, she took her first step toward a new future, one that was hers to shape, free from the ghosts of her past.